Hello, my name is Lilybell. They said I was born to fail, and for a long time I almost believed them. At every family dinner, every birthday, every casual get-together, I was the target, humiliated, isolated, erased. I trusted them. I stayed. I gave them every second chance they never deserved. Until one day, I made a phone call that shattered everything they had built. But what led me there? What did they steal before they stole my voice? And why? Why did they think I wouldn't fight back? The minute I pulled into the driveway, I knew it was going to be one of those days. The sun was doing its best to pretend it was warmer than it really was, but the crisp bite of spring clung to the air, warning me to stay sharp. Cedar Rapids had a way of making even a Sunday brunch feel like a corporate performance review, especially when it involved my family. The house looked the same, a modest two-story with beige siding and a desperate-for-weed-killer lawn. I sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than I should have, gathering myself. No point in delaying. They'd notice if I was late, and they'd never let me forget it. As soon as I stepped inside, the familiar tension wrapped around me like a scratchy sweater. Darlene's tight smile was the first thing that greeted me, polished to perfection, but with dead eyes that didn't quite match the warmth she tried to fake. Lorraine was already perched at the dining table, scrolling through her phone with that smirk she reserved especially for me. Victor, my stepfather, sat slouched in his chair, pretending to be interested in the newspaper he hadn't actually read in years. "About time," Darlene muttered, not bothering to hide her irritation. I shrugged off my jacket, forced a neutral expression, and took my seat at the far end of the table, the one that always felt like it was reserved for the outsider. Brunch was the usual: overcooked eggs, burnt bacon, and conversation as dry as the toast. Darlene started first, poking and prodding with thinly veiled criticism about my job, my apartment, my apparent inability to maintain a proper relationship. "I mean, Lilybell, at your age, most women are already settled. Don't you ever think about, stability?" she said, carefully buttering her toast as if each swipe were a jab to my self-worth. I smiled politely. "Stability is overrated." Victor snorted behind his newspaper, but said nothing. Typical. Lorraine chimed in next, setting her phone down dramatically. "Maybe you just set the bar too low for yourself. Or maybe you just don't have what it takes." Her voice was syrupy sweet, each word soaked in disdain. I kept my fork moving, cutting into my omelet, refusing to bite. They loved doing this. This subtle ambush, this tag-team demolition of whatever self-respect I managed to scrape together between visits. I used to think if I stayed quiet long enough, they'd get tired and move on. They never did. The conversation lulled, just for a second, the kind of pause that fills a room like thick smoke. That's when Lorraine leaned in, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "You were born to fail," she said, low and cold, like it was some universal truth she was simply stating for the record. The words landed harder than a slap. For a split second, the room froze. Even Darlene's butter knife hovered midair. Victor rustled his paper but didn't look up. Coward. I didn't blink, didn't flinch. I cut another bite of omelet, placed it carefully in my mouth, and chewed, tasting absolutely nothing. Inside, something shifted, something permanent. They think they can carve me up at the table like I'm Sunday roast? Fine, let them. But it would be the last time. Darlene coughed awkwardly, trying to smooth over Lorraine's cruelty with a fake laugh. "Oh, she's just teasing. You know how sisters are." Teasing. Right. Like a shark teases its prey before it bites. I finished my plate slowly, methodically, each scrape of my fork against the china deliberate. Darlene and Lorraine drifted into small talk about real estate prices, and Victor made some mumbled comment about interest rates. But the brunch was already dead in the water. When I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate, I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. I wasn't going to cry in my car like I had at Christmas. I wasn't going to spend the drive home replaying every insult, wondering if maybe they were right about me. Not this time. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping across the hardwood in a sound that made everyone wince. Good. Standing there, I looked at each of them. Darlene with her painted-on regret, Victor with his practiced indifference, Lorraine with her smug, victorious grin. I smiled back, slow and dangerous. This was fun. I said evenly. Really? Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. I didn't rush. No need. The storm wasn't here yet. But it was coming. As I stepped outside, the sun hit my face. Too bright. Too clean. I stood there for a second, breathing in the sharp spring air, feeling it fill the spaces their words had tried to hollow out. Maybe I was born to fail. Or maybe I was born to bury people like them. I walked to my car without looking back, started the engine, and pulled away from the house that had never really been a home. As the driveway shrank in the rearview mirror, I felt the weight begin to shift off my chest. The storm had only just begun, and for once I wasn't afraid of it. The drive away from the house felt endless, even though it was barely 15 minutes. The farther I went, the harder I gripped the wheel. I didn't bother with the radio. Silence fit better. The spring air slipped through the cracks of my aging car, cold enough to sting, but I welcomed it. It kept me alert. It kept the emotions from boiling over. The streets blurred together, rows of identical houses, clipped lawns, the same fake perfection I'd spent years trying to survive. At a red light, I froze even after it turned green, only moving when an angry honk jolted me back. My mind wasn't in Cedar Rapids anymore. It was back in the kitchen at 8 years old, clutching a dish towel, watching Lorraine strut with a medal that should have been mine. I had won the spelling bee. But Lorraine lied, saying it was her project that had impressed the judges. Darlene beamed at her like she'd cured cancer. "That's my girl, always making us proud," she said, ruffling Lorraine's hair while I scrubbed the counter in silence. At first I thought it was a mistake, that they'd realize, that they'd fix it. They didn't. They never did. It was the same with everything. I did the chores, Lorraine got the praise. I learned early, effort didn't matter, only credit did. And credit was reserved for someone else. My tires hummed over the town's bridge, the river below sluggish and brown with spring runoff, thick and heavy, just like the memories flooding back. I pulled into a parking lot by the river, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence. My phone vibrated on the seat beside me. I almost reached for it, then stopped. Nothing good was waiting on that screen. Instead, my mind returned to the email. I found it months ago, by accident, digging through an old cloud drive. Buried in a folder marked Taxes 2012 inches was a file, a copied email chain between Darlene and Lorraine. Subject, Re-updates. And there it was, plain as day. "Don't waste time worrying about Lilybell. She's not going anywhere. Just focus on your success. You're the one who matters." No hesitation, no second thoughts, just a plan to erase me from their lives. They hadn't forgotten me. They had decided I didn't matter. I stepped out of the car, the cold hitting me immediately. Gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the riverbank. The river moved slow and thick, reluctant, like it hated being forced forward. I crouched down, grabbed a stone, and tossed it in. A small plunk, a few ripples, then nothing. Just like me. Invisible, unless I made noise. Otherwise, forgotten. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets and stared at the horizon where the river met the sky. Somewhere beyond that line, people lived differently, where family meant protection, not performance, where love wasn't earned like a paycheck. Maybe I'd never have that. With them. But maybe I could build it for myself. I wasn't naive enough to think there'd be some miraculous apology. This wasn't a movie. Darlene and Lorraine didn't admit fault. They rewrote stories until they came out the heroes. I turned back to my car. The river kept moving, slow but steady, whether anyone noticed or not. Maybe that was the lesson. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need their love. I needed to move forward, even if nobody cared. The drive back blurred by. The same houses, the same stores. But it didn't matter anymore. My mind was already racing ahead, clearing space for something better. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the sky had darkened. Rain tapped against the windshield, steady and soft, like a memory you couldn't quite shake. Some storms didn't end. They just changed their form. I sat there watching the rain smear the world into watercolor shapes. Then I whispered the truth I should have said long ago. They didn't forget me. They erased me. And I wasn't going to let them do it again. The rain had long since dried up by the time the invitation came. It arrived through a group text that barely masked its real purpose. Family BBQ at our place this Saturday. Let's reconnect. Bring your appetite and good vibes. I stared at the message for a long time, letting it sit on my screen while the evening sun slipped lower behind the apartment buildings. Reconnect. Good vibes. Like a fresh coat of paint over a condemned house. It would have been easy to ignore it, pretend I was busy, that I hadn't seen it, but avoidance wasn't going to fix anything. They had taken enough from me in silence. If they wanted a show, they were going to get one, even if I was the only one in the audience who knew it. Saturday arrived with that early summer stickiness clinging to the air. I drove slowly to Darlene's house, windows down, trying to breathe through the anxiety tightening around my ribs. Pulling into their driveway felt like walking willingly into a trap. But this time, I wasn't naive enough to think a barbecue meant family bonding. The backyard was decked out in half-hearted celebration. Folding tables, paper plates, a cooler full of cheap beer. Darlene fluttered over with a too-wide smile, arms outstretched like we hadn't seen each other just weeks ago at that brunch from hell. "There's my girl," she chirped. "We've missed you." Missed me like a wolf misses a sheep, maybe. Lorraine lounged near the grill, beer in hand, sunglasses perched atop her perfect hair. She raised her drink toward me in mock salute before turning back to flirt with a neighbor. I stayed polite, guarded, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, as if one wrong step might trigger something ugly. I was done giving them ammunition. The first real crack appeared when Darlene pulled me aside, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "We had a little scare last week," she began, fussing with her bracelet like the drama embarrassed her. "Bank mistake. Thought we were going to lose the house." Lorraine was a wreck, bless her heart. She left out that it had been my late-night calls to the bank, my endless hours sifting through old account records, my research that uncovered the clerical error saving their home. Funny, she forgot to mention that part. The sun was sinking low, tinting everything gold, when Darlene gathered everyone around for a toast. I stayed at the edge of the group, arms crossed loosely, waiting. "To Lorraine!" Darlene beamed, holding up her cup. "Our saving grace once again. Always looking out for this family." I froze. Lorraine winked at me over her cup, a private little jab no one else noticed. My mouth stayed closed, but I could taste the metallic bitterness rising at the back of my throat. The others cheered, clinked cups, slapped Lorraine on the back. Not one person questioned it. I pressed my nails into my palms until I almost broke skin. Every fiber of my body screamed to shout the truth, to rip the facade down. But I didn't, not yet. Later, when the food was reduced to cold burgers and wilted salads, Darlene cornered me again near the kitchen door. "I need a small favor, honey," she said, using the tone she reserved for bad news dressed up as opportunity. She produced a set of documents with a flourish, like a magician revealing a trick. "It's just paperwork for the family," she said, avoiding my eyes, transferring the car title. "You're not really using it anymore, right? Lorraine could really use it with her new practice taking off. It would mean so much to her." My stomach twisted. That car wasn't much. An old Honda with a busted AC, but it was mine. Paid for with my own money. The only thing I hadn't begged or bartered for in this life. I scanned the papers quickly. It was all in order. Neat, official, final. "I'm sure you understand," Darlene added sweetly. "Family supports family." Family. That word again, used like a leash around my neck. Every instinct told me to rip the papers in half, to throw them in her carefully Botoxed face. But I didn't. I signed, slowly, deliberately, every letter an act of silent war. Darlene clapped her hands together like I had just agreed to attend a church bake sale. "You're such a good girl," she said, "always thinking of others." I handed her the pen without a word and stepped outside, my legs carrying me down the driveway, away from the circle of fairy lights and fake laughter. The sun had fully set now, leaving the world in that muted twilight where everything feels a little more honest, a little more raw. My car, my old car, sat gleaming under the streetlight, a prize ready to be handed over. I walked past it without touching it, without even glancing at it again. Let them have the Honda. Next time they tried to take something from me, they'd find their hands broken before I let them. I didn't slam my apartment door when I got home. I didn't throw anything. I just sat at the kitchen table in the dark, listening to the hum of the fridge, and started a list. A list of every slight, every theft, every betrayal, and a new goal. They wanted a villain? Fine. I'd show them one. The list was still fresh in my mind when the next invitation arrived. Another family dinner. Another opportunity for them to parade their loyalty to one another while using me as the silent punching bag. I thought about ignoring it, letting it slide into the pit of unanswered texts and missed calls where so many other regrets already lived. But deep down, I knew this was necessary. Sometimes you have to step into the fire to watch the house burn down. The evening was heavy, the clouds hanging low and brooding as I parked outside Darlene's house. I sat for a moment, watching the porch light flicker like a warning signal. Cedar Rapids was bracing for a storm, and so was I. Inside, the air was thick with forced politeness. The clatter of silverware on plates, the occasional burst of laughter that didn't reach anyone's eyes. Darlene floated between conversations, doling out compliments like cheap candy. Lorraine was already half a glass into her wine, her laughter sharp enough to cut glass. I took my place at the table, shoulders squared, chin high. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to mark the end. Dinner dragged on, a slow torture of small talk and sideways glances. I barely touched my food, chewing through polite responses while every nerve in my body stayed taut. It happened when I stood to refill my glass. Lorraine followed me to the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood like the ticking of a bomb. I kept my back to her, pouring water into my glass with deliberate calm. "You can pretend all you want," she hissed, voice low enough that only I could hear. "But no one's ever going to believe you." I turned slowly, meeting her gaze head-on. "You're nothing but a charity case in this family," she continued, her smile brittle. "Always have been." I took a steady sip from my glass, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "You can cry, you can scream, you can tell your little sob stories. No one's listening." She leaned in closer, her breath sour with wine. "You were born irrelevant." It was almost laughable how desperate she sounded. I set the glass down with a quiet clink and leaned closer until only she could hear me. "Keep talking," I said softly. "Every word you say just makes my case stronger." Her eyes narrowed, but I stepped away, leaving her standing there with her half-formed insults hanging uselessly in the air. The real ambush came during dessert. Darlene, flush from wine and flattery, waved her fork across the room in grand announcement. "And of course, we couldn't have gotten through this year without Rosa's help," she crowed, looking directly at me. Rosa, the name of the woman who cleaned their house twice a month? The laughter was instant, sharp, awkward, but loud enough to fill the room. Some of the cousins chuckled under their breath. Some looked away, pretending to find their dessert fascinating. I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Not Lilybell, Rosa. Because in their eyes, that's all I was. The help, an afterthought, a servant who forgot her place. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the tile with a sound that cut through the laughter like a scalpel. No one tried to stop me. No one called my name. No one cared enough to even be embarrassed. I picked up my purse with deliberate care, sliding the strap over my shoulder. Lorraine smirked into her wineglass. Darlene beamed like she'd just made the joke of the century. I looked around that table, at all the faces that had watched me drown and called it entertainment. And I made a decision. They would never have the chance to humiliate me again. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the door. My heels echoed in the silence that followed, each step a slow drumbeat of finality. At the doorway, I paused, just for a second, letting them all see my back straight, my head high. They thought they had seen my silence. They hadn't seen anything yet. The war had just begun, and this time, I wasn't coming with flowers. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence, of cool spring breezes rattling through the blinds, of my phone buzzing once or twice with hollow messages I didn't bother answering. 3 days where I rebuilt myself brick by brick, every moment sharpening the edges of the woman they had underestimated for far too long. By the 4th morning, the plan was set. Lorraine wasn't difficult to find. Her apartment wasn't far from Darlene's, nestled into a row of townhomes that all looked identical. Neutral, forgettable, like the people who lived inside. Perfect camouflage for someone who spent their life pretending to be more important than they really were. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up. The knock on her door was sharp, no nonsense. A beat passed, then two, before Lorraine pulled it open, her surprise quickly masked by a tight smile. "Well, look who finally grew a backbone," she said, leaning against the frame with studied nonchalance. I smiled politely. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside to let me in, closing the door with a click that felt a little too final. The living room was clean, but sterile. No personal touches, no real warmth. Lorraine gestured to the couch. I sat, setting my purse beside me carefully, angling it so the tiny recorder inside had a clear line of sound. She thought she was in control. Let her think it a little longer. Lorraine disappeared into the kitchen briefly, returning with 2 glasses of wine. I declined with a shake of my head. "Still so uptight," she muttered, dropping onto the opposite chair and crossing her legs elegantly. We danced around pleasantries for a moment, the air between us buzzing with the unspoken. Then she slid a folder across the coffee table toward me. "Figured you might want to get this over with," she said, flashing that fake smile I'd seen too many times. I opened the folder slowly, already guessing what it contained. Loan forgiveness forms, she claimed, legal jargon about family arrangements, mutual benefit. The language was slippery, full of loopholes big enough to drive a semi-truck through. At the bottom, the fine print. If I signed, I would be transferring full control of a small savings account left to me by my grandmother. The last shred of inheritance that hadn't already been siphoned off over the years. I looked up, meeting her eyes calmly. "Looks straightforward, right?" she said lightly, tapping the table with a manicured nail. I nodded once, making a show of scanning the papers, pretending to be overwhelmed, trusting. Inside, my stomach churned, but not from nerves. From rage held tightly on a leash. I picked up the pen she offered, rolled it between my fingers for a moment, and then signed, carefully, deliberately, leaving one small intentional error in my signature that would void the document later if challenged. A tiny break in the loop of my B, almost invisible to anyone but me. Lorraine smiled like a cat watching a trapped bird flutter against the cage bars. As I pushed the folder back across the table, I met her gaze squarely. "You know," I said casually, "it's funny. For someone so convinced I'm worthless, you sure spend a lot of time trying to take what little I have." Her smile flickered. "If you come for me again," I said, my voice dropping low enough to slice through the room, "you won't like what happens next. No shouting, no drama, just a promise." I stood, gathering my purse, feeling the recorder's slight weight reassuring against my side. Lorraine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her smirk had slipped entirely by then, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something resembling uncertainty flicker in her eyes. Good. I didn't slam the door behind me. I didn't need the noise to announce my departure. Quiet could be a weapon too, if you wielded it properly. Outside, the late afternoon was slipping into evening, the sky bruised with clouds but holding back rain. I walked to my car without rushing, every step grounding me more firmly into myself. This wasn't just about a car anymore, or a savings account, or even the years they had stolen. This was about reclaiming the parts of me they had tried to erase. That night at home, I pulled out the files I had been quietly compiling, old bank statements with suspicious withdrawals, screenshots of late-night messages between Darlene and Lorraine, plotting loans that were never repaid. Copies of emails where they badmouthed me to distant relatives, making sure to position themselves as the saints and me as the burden. I spread them out across the table, like puzzle pieces. My arsenal. They had built their kingdom on lies. They had forgotten that paper trails don't burn as easily as bridges. It wasn't enough to get angry anymore. It was time to get even. And smart. I slipped on a pair of latex gloves and began carefully filing each document into labeled folders. Financial misconduct, character assassination, asset coercion, each title a blade honed sharper by the hour. The city outside moved on, oblivious. Horns honked in the distance. Dogs barked. Somewhere down the street, laughter floated into the cooling air. And inside, in the quiet of my tiny kitchen, A war machine was being built, not out of hate, out of survival. By the time they realized I wasn't bluffing, it would already be too late. The war machine was ready, but even the sharpest sword waits for the right moment to strike. 2 weeks passed under a sky that rarely showed its full blue anymore. Gray hung overhead like a held breath, a promise that something worse was coming. I went to work. I went through the motions. I smiled when necessary, nodded when expected. Outwardly, I looked the same. Inside, I was counting down. Then, the first blow landed, and it didn't come from where I expected. I had just started seeing someone, a man named Carter. We met at a local bookstore of all places, an almost laughably wholesome beginning compared to the twisted mess I lived with every day. He was kind. He listened. He didn't flinch when I talked about rebuilding my life. It had been a few cautious weeks of coffee dates, evening walks, text messages that made me smile despite myself. For the first time in years, I allowed the smallest bud of hope to bloom in my chest. I should have known it wouldn't last. It started with Carter canceling a date with a vague excuse, then another. Finally, a text, cold, detached, explaining that things felt complicated and he didn't think it was a good idea to continue. No warning, no explanation. Confused, I called once. It went straight to voicemail. No callback. Something twisted low in my gut. I didn't have to wonder long. The next day, a mutual acquaintance at the bookstore mentioned, almost apologetically, that someone had warned Carter about me, said I was unstable, vindictive, dangerous when rejected. The phrases were too precise, too familiar. Lorraine's fingerprints were all over it. I thanked the acquaintance and excused myself before my hands started shaking in public. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Betrayal, cold and oily, oozed through my veins. Not just because of Carter. I barely knew him. It was what he represented. A life beyond them, beyond the cage they had built for me. And Lorraine had smashed it with one whispered lie. I stayed in that car until the streetlights flickered on, until the dusk melted into full night. When I finally climbed the stairs to my door, my phone buzzed. An email from HR. Subject line, urgent. Request for immediate discussion. My stomach dropped. At work the next morning, it was all too clear. The side glances, the sudden silences when I walked into a room. People I had laughed with a week ago now studied me like I might explode. In the meeting, the HR manager was polite but stiff. We received an anonymous tip about inappropriate behavior, she said, sliding a thin file across the table. Inside, vague allegations, nothing specific enough to pin anything on me, but enough to tarnish, to whisper, to poison. No names, no witnesses, just the stink of suspicion, carefully crafted. I nodded through the meeting, made all the right noises about professionalism and transparency. Inside, a different kind of fire caught. Lorraine hadn't just tried to cut me off from family. She was trying to erase my future, too. I returned to my desk under fluorescent lights that suddenly felt harsher than usual. I logged onto my computer. I pulled up copies of my last 6 months of performance reviews, glowing. No incidents, no warnings. I quietly started downloading copies of everything. Emails, commendations, project assignments, building my side of the story. They thought they could smear me into silence. They thought wrong. That night, I didn't bother turning on the lights when I got home. The city outside kept humming. Cars passing, televisions flickering through half-closed blinds, lives moving forward. My apartment sat in stillness, waiting. I spread the new files across the kitchen table beside the old ones. HR summaries, gossip trails, shredded reputations built by careful malice. Piece by piece, I mapped out the attack, the pattern, the escalation. They hadn't gotten sloppy. They had gotten arrogant. It would be their downfall. I stared at the evidence, feeling the final remnants of fear burn away, leaving only focus behind. If they wanted a war, they would get one. They wanted me quiet. They were about to learn what real noise sounded like. The rain didn't just fall that night. It clawed at the windows like it wanted in. I sat there at my kitchen table, surrounded by folders and files, the storm outside matching the storm inside my chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even hurt. It was a new thing, colder and sharper, something that didn't shake or flinch. I was done waiting. The hours stretched thin and heavy. Somewhere past midnight, after the last crack of thunder had rumbled low across the sky, I clicked open a folder I hadn't touched in years. A backup from my father's old hard drive, saved during the chaos of our family's ugly unraveling. Most of it was junk, half-finished spreadsheets, random family photos, old tax returns. But tucked between two forgotten budget reports was something else. An email, still in draft form, never sent. I almost deleted it without reading, but something about the timestamp caught my eye. Dated just days before Lorraine had accused our father of threatening violence, back when custody battles and restraining orders had torn what little family we had into pieces. I opened it, my blood iced over. It was a letter, written in Lorraine's voice, but directed from our father. A fabricated rant, filled with threats he never made, hate he never spoke. Lorraine had written it herself, saved it, polished it, and then somehow used it to ignite a fire that had burned for years. Reading it, piece by piece, was like pulling glass out of my skin. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as the truth landed fully, finally, without mercy. Lorraine hadn't just been cruel. She had orchestrated everything, and Darlene? She had chosen to believe it, because it was easier than facing who Lorraine really was, and what that said about her as a mother. The rain began to ease, a soft drizzle now, almost apologetic. I closed the laptop with a click that sounded louder than it should have. They had erased our father to make themselves the victims. They had erased me because I refused to play along. Not anymore. I pushed the laptop aside and checked my phone out of habit. A new message buzzed onto the screen, a screenshot forwarded from a distant cousin. A group chat thread titled, Family Reunion Planning. Photos of the house decorated in cheap streamers, a cake with family forever, scrawled across it, jokes about who would bring the potato salad, who would man the grill, and not a single mention of me. At the bottom of the thread, a cousin had typed, "Well, at least no drama this time, right?" And another had replied, "Exactly. No Lilybell to bring the rain cloud." I stared at the screen, the text burning into my eyes like acid. Not invited, not missed, not even hated enough to lie about. Just erased. Funny thing about erasure, though. You only think you're getting away with it until the ghost you created decides to haunt you. I stood, every movement deliberate, every breath sharpened to a blade. Enough. I spent the rest of the night assembling everything. Timelines, documents, testimonies, every lie they ever told and every proof they ever left behind, because they never thought I'd be smart enough or strong enough to gather it all. The storm had moved on by dawn, but its weight still clung to the streets, heavy and wet. I stepped outside with a manila folder under my arm, a copy of every piece of evidence tucked inside. The world smelled like wet asphalt and coming reckoning. I drove to my attorney's office downtown. No radio, no distractions, just the steady thump of the windshield wipers and my own heart beating a slow, sure drum. The receptionist looked up as I entered, gave me a small, curious smile. I returned it with one of my own, a sharp, contained smile, like a knife slid back into its sheath. "I'm here to file a complaint," I said. "Against my sister, against my mother, against the lies they built their lives on." The receptionist nodded, pointing me toward the right office. I walked there without hesitation, every step rooted in purpose. They wanted to erase me? Fine. I'd erase every false story they ever spun, every lie they ever wove into our family's name. They erased me from their family, I thought, clutching the folder tighter. Now I'll erase their lies from existence. Some wars you run from? Some wars you survive, and some you become. The morning the fallout began, Cedar Rapids looked almost too calm, too clean, as if the town itself hadn't yet realized something rotten was about to be exposed. I sat at my kitchen table, clutching a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. My laptop screen glowed in the dim light, a single line of text blinking back at me. "Your complaint has been received and is under formal investigation." A second email followed minutes later, from the State Bar Association. A third came from the Ethics Committee. Each one was a small detonation in a quiet war. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. The satisfaction I felt wasn't loud or giddy. It was bone deep and unshakable, the way the earth feels after a storm has passed, knowing nothing will ever grow the same way again. The first ripples hit just before noon. Lorraine's law firm circulated a bland internal memo. Pending investigation, Lorraine Weston will be taking a leave of absence. Not voluntary, not optional. A polite corporate muzzle strapped tightly over a growing scandal. I knew exactly how those kinds of emails worked. Full of vague wording, desperate to control the narrative before anyone else could. Too late. Rumors spread faster than wildfire once you lit the right match. And I had set mine quietly, methodically, in all the right places. A few whispered calls to colleagues who remembered odd discrepancies in Lorraine's case files, an anonymous tip to a legal gossip blog, a few screenshots in the right private Facebook groups. By mid-afternoon, Lorraine's name wasn't just whispered in corners, it was trending. #Lorraine Weston Ethics Inquiry. I watched from a distance, not out of cruelty, but clarity. They had built everything on deception. I was simply pulling back the curtain. My phone buzzed again. Another email, this time a news alert. Local attorney under investigation for professional misconduct. Her face stared back at me from the screen. The carefully curated headshot she used for years. Polished, perfect, smiling. Now a mask cracking in public view. Around 3 p.m., I received a text from an old acquaintance who still worked at Lorraine's firm. "It's a bloodbath here. Half her clients already bailed. Partner meetings nonstop. You okay?" I stared at the message for a moment, feeling a strange mix of emotions tighten my chest. Was I okay? The part of me that still believed in happy endings, in fairy tales about families healing if you just tried hard enough, wanted to be sad, wanted to grieve. But the woman sitting in my chair now, the woman who had dug herself out of the grave they'd shoved her into, she felt something else. Freedom. Real freedom doesn't come dressed in forgiveness. It comes wrapped in hard decisions and lonely roads, and the kind of clarity that hurts more than it heals, at least at first. By late evening, the final blow landed. Lorraine's law license had been formally suspended pending investigation. It was a cold, bureaucratic phrase, but to me it sounded like justice. No fireworks, no applause, just a simple notice delivered to her registered address, the same way they served subpoenas and eviction warnings. I imagined her standing in her high-rise downtown condo, reading the letter with shaking hands, realizing for the first time that there would be no spin big enough to save her this time. No poor me sob stories. No more sacrificial scapegoats. No more Lilybell to blame. She was finally going to have to wear her own sins, raw, heavy, and permanent. The streets outside my apartment buzzed with ordinary life. People walking dogs, teenagers laughing on their bikes, delivery drivers honking impatiently. The world hadn't ended. It had just corrected itself in one small, necessary way. I decided to mark the moment, not with champagne, not with revenge fantasies, but with something quieter, something stronger. I grabbed my keys, slipped on a jacket, and drove downtown. The evening was cool, with just a whisper of the rain that had washed the city the night before. Lorraine's firm sat on the corner of the business district, tall, proud, expensive. Tonight its windows were dark. A simple white paper taped to the glass door read, "Closed for private firm matter." I stood there for a long minute, feeling nothing and everything all at once. This was the empire they had built. This was the castle made of lies, and it was crumbling, not because I screamed and begged and pleaded, but because I simply showed the world what it had always been underneath the marble floors and polished smiles. Rot. I turned away without looking back. They would say I destroyed her. Maybe I did, but only because she handed me the match, poured the gasoline, and dared me to strike it. They built a castle on lies, I thought, slipping back into my car, the seat cold against my back. I just showed them where the rot was. Some endings aren't about revenge. Some are about reclaiming something you should have never had to lose in the first place. Your voice, your dignity, your right to exist without apology. The morning air smelled different now, cleaner somehow, even sharper. A month had passed since the world I once knew crumbled, and I hadn't looked back. I moved into a new apartment in the quieter part of Cedar Rapids. It wasn't glamorous. No sweeping city views, no designer furniture. Just 3 modest rooms filled with secondhand treasures, books stacked in uneven piles, a worn but comfortable couch, and a tiny desk shoved up against a sunlit window. And yet, it was the first place that ever truly felt like mine. I spent those first weeks piecing together a new life, brick by brick. I picked up freelance work where I could, editing, consulting, writing small reports for local businesses, nothing flashy but honest. No one here cared who my family was or what drama I had left behind. They judged me on my work, my kindness, my persistence. It was enough. Each morning, I brewed my coffee in a battered French press, opened my laptop, and slowly rebuilt something they never thought I'd have: independence. It wasn't a dramatic rebirth. Healing rarely is. It's not fireworks and grand speeches. It's standing up every morning when no one claps, feeding yourself hope one small spoonful at a time. Sometimes, though, the past seeped in, a word, a smell, a half-remembered song on the radio. Suddenly, I'd be back at that brunch table, swallowing humiliation like bitter wine. I'd hear Lorraine's voice, sharp, sneering, or see Darlene's patronizing smile floating through my mind like smoke. But I didn't drown in those memories anymore. I let them pass through me, the way rain moves through a sieve. I didn't pretend they hadn't happened. I just refused to build a monument to them inside me. The scars were there, sure, but they no longer defined me. One crisp morning, as I organized paperwork by the kitchen table, the past came knocking one last time. A thick manila envelope slipped through the mail slot. I opened it without much thought, scanning the legal jargon printed neatly across the top. Civil lawsuits against Lorraine, multiple plaintiffs, financial restitution demanded. Attached was a copy of her official disciplinary ruling, her law license permanently revoked. Her carefully constructed empire had finally, officially fallen. The last page was a personal note, handwritten, desperate. It wasn't from Lorraine, it was from Darlene. "You destroyed this family," it read. "I hope you're proud of yourself." There was no apology, no reflection, only blame, still flung like mud against a wall already crumbling. I read it once, calmly, then folded the letter in half and dropped it in the recycling bin. They were still playing the same broken record. I had just stopped listening. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the small park near my new place. Autumn had touched everything, turning the trees into burning bursts of amber and crimson. The breeze was cool against my face, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke. Children chased each other across the grass. Dogs barked, straining against their leashes. Joggers passed by, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Life kept moving forward, with or without me, and for the first time in a long time, I wanted to move with it. I found a bench under a towering oak, its leaves rattling overhead like soft applause. I sat there quietly, feeling the weight of the past slide off my shoulders, leaving only a faint outline behind, a reminder, not a chain. They said I was born to fail, I thought, pulling my jacket tighter around myself against the breeze. Maybe they were right. Not because I had failed, but because I was never meant to succeed their way. Their version of success meant obedience, silence, sacrifice. Their version of love meant conditions, contracts, claws hidden behind smiles. I wasn't born to carry on that legacy. I was born to break it. I smiled then, not the brittle, polite smile I used to wear at family functions, but something real, something earned. Freedom tastes quieter than you think. It's a simple moment, sitting on a park bench with no one expecting anything from you, feeling your own heartbeat like a drum saying, "You made it. You're still here. You get to start over. And this time, I am choosing what success looks like. After everything I've been through, one truth stands clear. You don't have to inherit someone else's version of success. You don't owe loyalty to people who poison your spirit and call it love. And most importantly, you have every right to walk away from a family that chooses pride over kindness. It's not weakness to leave toxicity behind. It's strength to build peace from the ashes they left you. If my story resonates with you, I want you to remember. Your voice matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable. Your life deserves better than silent suffering. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after being betrayed by the people you loved most? What does true success mean to you today? If this video touched something inside you, please drop a 1 inch in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Or if you felt differently, I'd love to hear why. Your story matters too. And if you want to join me for more real stories about strength, healing, and standing tall against the odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and be part of this community. There's a lot more life left to live, and we're just getting started.